She didn't know where the blood trail ended, but it began behind her cabin. Mirelda had just stepped out with a pail of dishwater when she spotted the churned earth near the tree line. Her boots froze. There, barely breathing, stood a stallion so battered it looked more ghost than beast, one eye swollen shut, flanks torn open as if it had fought wolves or worse. She set the pail down without thinking. "Easy now," she whispered, hands raised. The horse didn't bolt. It just trembled, ribs shuddering with each breath. Slowly, Mirelda backed into the cabin, grabbed what oats and water she had, and crept back. She'd nursed her father through fever, a dying hawk once, and even a rattlesnake-bit child who stumbled into town, but never a full-grown stallion with wounds like this. And still, it let her near. For 3 days, she kept the animal alive. By the third evening, the stallion had eaten from her hand and let her dab his wounds with soaked cloth. It never whinnied, never looked toward the hills, just stared at her, as if memorizing her soul. But on the morning of the 4th day, something changed. Mirelda stepped out with her usual tin of warm oats, expecting to find the horse curled beside the woodpile. Instead, it was gone. No sound, no hoof prints, as if it had evaporated. But what made her drop the oats, what made her heart lurch and her knees buckle, was what now hung from the hook on her front door. A wedding dress, handmade, white linen, with delicate blue embroidery. Her size, fresh, folded neatly with a sprig of pine beneath it. No footprints in the dirt, no sound in the trees, no note, just the stillness of a summer morning and that impossible dress swaying slightly in the wind. Mirelda stepped back, hand trembling as she reached for the fabric. Her cabin had seen many things, storms, hunger, loneliness, but never this. She wasn't the kind of woman men left dresses for, and yet someone had. And she knew in her gut it was connected to the horse. Something was coming, or had already arrived. And her life, whatever it had been before those 3 days, was over. She didn't sleep that night. The dress lay folded on her table, untouched, like a riddle she was afraid to solve. Mirelda sat beside it in her rocker, listening for any sound from the trees. The creak of a stirrup, the crack of a branch. But the world remained still. It wasn't until dawn that she saw it. Hoof prints. Not just one set, but 2. One she recognized. The battered stallion's uneven gait carved clearly into the dirt. The other was lighter, tighter, and circled her cabin 3 times. That second horse had carried a rider. Mirelda followed the tracks through the woods, her breath tight. They led not back into the open prairie, but down into the gulch where the dry riverbed ran, winding like a vein through the land. That's when she saw it, half buried under leaves, tucked against the canyon wall. A saddle, handmade, with beadwork too fine for trade. It had no name carved into it, but the leather bore the shape of someone who had ridden it often. Next to it, a length of buckskin with something wrapped inside. She unrolled it slowly, a braid of her own hair. She stumbled back, her hands shaking. She hadn't worn her hair in a braid since the spring. She thought she'd burned that lock in the fire after cutting it during the worst night of winter. But now, it was here, wrapped in hide, waiting, and someone had known exactly where to find it. Mirelda gripped the saddle's horn to steady herself. She wasn't just being watched, she was being remembered. She took the bundle back to her cabin and placed it next to the dress. Whatever had begun with the horse, it wasn't over. Not by a long stretch. That afternoon, a wind picked up from the south, carrying with it a smell she hadn't known in years, smoke and cedar and something else. A scent that made her think of the Comanche village her mother once traded in, far before the world changed and the lines were drawn. Mirelda didn't go back outside that night. But before she barred the door, she left the dress on the porch. If they wanted her to wear it, they'd have to explain why. By morning, the dress was gone. Not blown off, not stolen, just gone, like it had never been there. But in its place, someone had left something else. A strip of red cloth, frayed at the ends, tied gently around the handle of her water pail. Mirelda stared at it, unmoving, her breath stuck between questions. She reached out and touched it. It was damp with dew but still warm, as if someone had tied it just minutes ago. That kind of cloth didn't come from town. It came from warriors, from dances, from those who still honored the old ways. She'd seen it once before, years ago, when her brother came back from a failed cattle deal and spoke of Comanche scouts marking trails not with weapons, but colors. Red meant blood had been shed, or was about to be. Mirelda sat down hard on her porch step. She thought of the Stallion, still resting behind the cabin, of the tracks that circled her home, of the saddle hidden in the canyon. She had nursed that horse because it had come to her broken, because something in her couldn't look away from pain. But now, the pain was circling back. She stood and followed the red cloth trail, because there was one now, a second piece tied to the split rail fence, then another hanging from a low cedar branch. It wasn't leading her away, it was leading her inward, toward the deeper woods, toward the ravine that swallowed light like a mouth. And at the mouth of that ravine, she saw him. A man standing just beyond the shadow line. Young, tall, arms crossed over his chest, his dark hair braided, his shoulders bare but marked with old symbols. He didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at her like he already knew what she'd say. Mirelda's throat tightened. This wasn't a threat. It was a choice. The warrior hadn't come to claim, not yet. He had come to see if she would follow. She took one step closer, and he vanished, as if made of smoke and silence. Only then did she notice. The Stallion behind her cabin was gone, too. Not limping, not dragged, gone without a trace, and all he'd left behind was a single red feather, tucked where the dress had first appeared. She didn't sleep that night. Mirelda sat with her rifle across her lap, lantern burning low, waiting for something, anything, to return. The red feather lay beside her on the table, its end worn, as if gripped tightly by a human hand. Every creak in the trees made her breath catch, not from fear, from knowing, because whoever had walked into her life wasn't done. At dawn, she stepped outside and found hoof prints, dozens, not just the Stallion's, lighter ones, smaller ones, circling the clearing like a ceremonial path. Then, above her doorframe, etched faintly in soot, was a name. Tamana. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't hers. It wasn't English, but it wasn't hostile either. The strokes were careful, deliberate, carved as if marking something sacred. She touched the word with her fingers and felt warmth, like the wood still remembered his hand. That afternoon, she rode into town to speak with Nara, the half-Comanche herbalist who sold tonics and truths behind her quiet little shed. When Mirelda told her about the horse, the dress, the man in the trees, and finally the word carved above her home, Nara went silent. Tamana, she said finally, means the one who mends without asking. Mirelda blinked. Why would he call me that? Nara met her eyes with something between awe and sadness. Because it's a title reserved for those who take in what others abandon. Mirelda left town with more questions than she came with, but one thing settled like a weight in her chest. The man hadn't chosen her out of desperation. He'd been watching, waiting, testing, and she had passed some ancient test without even knowing. That night, when she returned home, the wedding dress was back. This time not draped but folded, placed carefully in a carved cedar box that hadn't been there before. On top of the fabric lay a bone-carved pin in the shape of a hawk, and next to it, a small woven pouch with her name burned into the leather. Mirelda. No more red cloth, no more feathers, just this, an offering, and perhaps a question. She picked up the hawk pin, turned it in her hand, and whispered the name she hadn't spoken aloud until now. "He's asking," she said. But for what? The wind shifted that night, carrying with it a silence too heavy to ignore. Mirelda stepped outside with the hawk pin still clenched in her hand, heart pounding in a rhythm she didn't understand. She'd left the cedar box untouched on her porch, half daring him to come take it back, half hoping he would return to explain it. But when she reached for the latch at sundown, she saw him. Not approaching from the trees this time, not lurking, standing still just beyond the fence. Tall. Still. Dressed in soft leather, his chest bare save for the bone necklace that pulsed with every breath he took. It was the man from the trees. But now, in the daylight, he looked less like a ghost, and more like a man carrying the weight of many ghosts. She didn't run, and he didn't speak. Instead, he reached into the pouch at his side and held up a small item, a carving, of a horse, of that horse. Mirelda stepped forward. "He's yours," she said, voice steadier than she felt. The man nodded once. She offered him the pouch with her name on it. Unsure what he expected her to do with it, he took it gently, turned it in his hand, and tied it to the hilt of the knife strapped to his thigh. Then he placed the carving in her palm. "Why me?" she whispered. His eyes softened. Then he pointed to the scar across his shoulder, then the stallion in the pen, then to the sky. A slow motion of his hand touching his chest, then hers. She understood none of the symbols, and yet all of them. He was telling her a story, one only shared through gestures, through trust, through watching what someone does when no one asks them to, and Mirelda had passed his story's test. "You could have just asked," she said, but her voice cracked with something deeper, because she knew why he hadn't. He needed to see her soul first, not just her face, not just her food, her choice, and she had chosen kindness when no one else was looking. The stallion neighed behind them, low and alive. Mirelda looked once more at the wedding dress folded on the porch, then back at the man. "So, you're not here to take anything?" she murmured. He shook his head. Then, with a silent reverence, he placed one hand to his chest and extended it to her. Not a demand, a proposal. Mirelda didn't move for a long time. The air between them held something sacred, something older than words. Her eyes dropped to the hand he held out, not forceful, not assuming, just waiting. Her breath hitched. Her life had been quiet for so long, reduced to chores and silence and glances no one returned. She'd fed a horse, not knowing it was a test. She'd opened her door to suffering, not knowing it would lead to a vow. She reached out slowly, not to take his hand, but to turn toward the porch. With deliberate steps, she walked to the wedding dress still draped across the rail. Her fingers slid along the fabric. It was simple, no lace, no glitter, just cloth, white as creek foam, stitched by hands that had meant it to last. She turned to him, still standing there like a statue carved by longing. "Did you put this here?" she asked, her voice barely carrying. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Her heart already knew. It hadn't been a gesture of ownership. It was an invitation to choose, to walk toward him on her own terms. Mirelda folded the dress over her arm and stepped back into the cabin. Minutes passed. Then the door opened again. She stood there barefoot, hair tied back, the dress now hugging her like it had waited all its life to belong to her. She hadn't cleaned up. She hadn't painted her face. She had done nothing except say yes, without words, without ceremony, just by showing up in the dress that had been left as a question. His breath caught when he saw her. For the first time, the Lakota warrior blinked away something close to tears. He stepped forward and lifted the hawk pin from around his neck. She turned, without needing instruction, and allowed him to pin it at the neckline. No kiss followed. No crowd applauded. No preacher said words. And yet, to the wind, to the horse still resting in the pen, to the world that had almost forgotten her, they were now bound. Not by paper, not by pressure, but by something both wilder and gentler. Something chosen. She looked up at him. "Do you have a name?" she asked. He smiled faintly, then finally spoke, his voice like soft gravel and river stone. "Chayton." She whispered it back. "Chayton." And just like that, she wasn't alone anymore. That night, Chayton stayed beside the stallion while Mirelda lit a lantern and made tea from dried leaves she hadn't touched in years. The dress was folded again now, not worn, but resting on the table like a promise. She watched from the window as the Lakota knelt by the animal, whispering words into its ear, brushing its side with the care of someone who'd known the horse longer than most people know family. When he came back in, he didn't bring explanations. He brought questions. "Why did you help him?" he asked. Mirelda stirred the tea. "Because no one else would." Chayton's eyes held something unreadable, but not cold. "That stallion belonged to my brother. He rode him the day our camp was attacked. The horse came back without him, bleeding, saddle torn. I followed the trail and found the blood still drying outside your cabin." Mirelda sat down slowly. "You thought I had something to do with it." "I did," he admitted. "But then I saw you out there. No blade, no rifle, just your hands, pressing cloth against his wounds. You'd fed him before you fed yourself." He paused. "No one does that for a stranger." Mirelda didn't answer right away. Her mind was circling something she hadn't let herself say aloud. "When I saw him, it wasn't just a horse. It was the first thing in years that looked back at me like I mattered." The room grew quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. Chayton leaned forward. "My brother died near the river, but not before he whispered one word. South. I didn't know what it meant, until I found your cabin." Mirelda's throat tightened. "Why would he have said that?" "Because south was where you were," Chayton said. "Maybe he saw you once. Maybe he heard stories. Or maybe the horse knew where to go." She blinked rapidly. So the stallion carried more than wounds. He nodded. "He carried my brother's last hope." The tea between them had gone cold, but neither of them cared. Mirelda suddenly reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He didn't flinch, and in that touch, something deeper than grief passed between them, something that made both the past and the future feel less lonely. The next morning, Mirelda rose early to fetch water, her boots crunching on dry pine needles as she crossed toward the well. The sun had only begun to cut through the branches when she stopped cold. The wedding dress, gone the night before, was hanging once again on the porch, this time neatly buttoned at the back and no longer wind-blown. But something else had changed. Draped gently over the dress's hanger was a beaded necklace, with a small eagle feather tied at the center. Mirelda stared, heart thudding. She hadn't heard a soul all night, and yet someone had come, returned the dress, and added this token. She turned slowly. Chayton stood behind her now, the stallion trailing weakly at his side. "I didn't leave it," he said softly. "But I know who did." He walked past her and ran a hand along the edge of the porch rail, like he was reading an old memory etched in wood. "My mother," he said. "She was a medicine woman. After my brother died, she disappeared into the northern hills. I thought she was gone for good. But this is her sign." Mirelda touched the necklace with trembling fingers. "She wants you to marry me." "She wants to honor my brother's last will," he said. "And maybe to see you as kin, not just some settler woman with a kind heart." Mirelda's throat tightened. "You don't even know me." "I know you didn't turn away a dying creature. I know you never asked for anything in return." His voice dropped lower. "And I know my brother's blood led to your door, not by chance." Mirelda stepped back inside, leaving the door ajar. Chayton followed, but paused as he looked again at the dress. "Did you once hope to wear something like that?" She gave a bitter smile. "Years ago, before everything fell apart, before I ran west with a broken heart and a pack of lies." He studied her for a long moment, then took the dress gently from the hanger. "Then maybe it's time to try again," he said. He didn't push. He just handed it to her, like an offering, not a demand. And as she stood in the doorway, wedding dress in her hands, and the stallion watching silently behind him, Mirelda felt something shift. Not just around her, but inside her too. Mirelda didn't touch the dress for hours. It hung by her bedpost like a ghost of the life she'd buried long ago, a symbol of something once lost and now mysteriously offered back. She spent most of the day tending the stallion with Chayton nearby, neither of them speaking much, but something softer had passed between them, unspoken and steady. That evening, as the light shifted gold through the trees, Mirelda stood outside her cabin, the dress pressed to her chest. "You sure?" Chayton asked quietly, his eyes never pushing, only open. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between fear and grace. "Not because your mother asked, or your brother, but because I want to start again, with truth this time." He didn't smile, but something deep in his face relaxed. "Then we begin tonight." Mirelda went inside and, with trembling hands, stepped into the gown. It fit better than she remembered her own ever fitting, like it had waited for her. She braided her hair down her back and stepped out barefoot, the earth cool beneath her feet. Chayton stood beside a small circle of stones near the barn, where the stallion lay sleeping, finally at peace. In the center burned a modest flame, and around it, in utter silence, stood 5 figures cloaked in hides and beads, Comanche elders, faces marked by years, eyes gleaming with quiet judgment. One of the women stepped forward, his mother. She placed a painted bowl of earth and sage in Mirelda's hands and spoke only one word. "Welcome." That was all. No grand ceremony, no vows spoken aloud. Just the wind whispering through pine, the fire crackling between them, and the knowledge that every soul here had seen Mirelda not as an outsider, not as a mistake, but as someone worthy of staying. Chayton reached for her hand, and she gave it freely, not with hesitation, but with a silent promise. They didn't kiss. They didn't declare anything. But when the fire died and the elders disappeared like smoke into the trees, Mirelda and Chayton stood alone in the dusk, bound by something stronger than paper or prayer. She had fed a broken creature out of instinct. She had opened her door when no one was watching, and in return, the world, quietly, patiently, had handed her back a future she'd never dared ask for. The next morning, Mirelda rose before the sun, not out of habit, but out of hope. The stallion had finally stood on his own, swaying but upright, as if the land itself had given him permission to keep going. She watched him from her window, the way his ears flicked toward the trees, his breath steaming gently in the morning chill. Then she turned toward the wedding dress, now folded neatly across the cedar chest, no longer a mystery, but a marker, of grace, of choices made, of love that didn't ask but honored. Chayton was already outside, splitting wood. He looked over his shoulder when she opened the door and smiled, not the kind that begged or boasted, but the kind that saw her. "You sleep?" he asked. "I dreamed," she said, stepping onto the porch. "That's better." They worked in silence that morning, but it wasn't empty. There were no papers signed, no preacher's words, no town to gossip or witness. And yet everything had changed. The land knew. The animals moved more gently around her. Even the wind felt like it asked permission now before brushing past the cabin. In the distance, Mirelda saw 3 Comanche children appear at the tree line. Curious, shy, and waiting. She waved them in. They came slowly, the smallest holding a carved stick that looked like a bird. "My mama said you can teach us letters," the tallest one said. Mirelda knelt to their level. "I can, but you'll have to help me teach the horse how to listen first." They giggled, nodded, and sat in the dirt like it was a classroom. Chayton leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, that same quiet awe on his face. Later, she would bake bread for the first time in weeks. She would cut fabric for blankets the tribe had gifted her. She would tell stories in 2 languages and learn more in return. That night, the stallion would stand at the window again, as if guarding something sacred. And before she blew out the lantern, Mirelda would whisper, "Thank you," not to the sky or to the man sleeping beside her, but to the version of herself who had knelt in the mud and fed a wounded creature without expecting anything in return. That woman, silent, uncelebrated, had cracked the door open to grace. And now, grace had made itself at home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you saw a wedding dress on your porch after nursing a wounded soul, would you have worn it too?